Welcome to the Stillness Broadcast. Tonight we venture into places where comfort becomes trap, where safety reveals itself as the cruelest illusion. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. There's something profound about knowing we're scattered across the world, yet gathered here in the darkness together. If these stories find their way into your dreams tonight, know you're not alone in that either. Let's begin. Story 1. The perfume arrived on a Tuesday, which Margot Caldwell would later recognize as the first in a series of details that should have warned her. She stood in the doorway of her studio apartment on Divisadero Street, looking down at the package that had been left outside her door. No return address, just her name in elegant script across brown paper wrapping, the ink slightly smudged as if the writer's hand had been unsteady. San Francisco in March carried the smell of fog and exhaust, but when Margot bent to retrieve the package, she caught something else beneath the usual city odors. Something sweet and old, like flowers left too long in a vase. At 32, Margot had developed certain habits that came from living alone in an expensive city on a social worker's salary. She didn't buy things she didn't need. She certainly didn't order perfume. The last bottle she'd owned had been a gift from her mother 3 years ago. Before the stroke, before the nursing home, before the slow erasure of recognition in eyes that had once known her better than anyone. She carried the package inside and set it on her kitchen counter, then stood looking at it for longer than made sense. The apartment was quiet in the way that only urban apartments could be, not silent, but full of muffled sounds from other lives. Footsteps above her, television through the wall, the hum of the refrigerator that had been struggling since January. Her therapist, Dr. Kine, had suggested she might benefit from more time at home, from learning to be comfortable in her own space rather than filling every evening with volunteer shifts and double sessions at the community center. "You're avoiding something," Dr. Kane had said in their last session, her pale gray eyes watching Margot with that particular attention that suggested Eastern European ancestry and decades of listening to people lie to themselves. The question is what? Margot opened the package carefully, preserving the brown paper in case she needed to trace its origin. Inside was a bottle, perhaps 4 inches tall, made of dark glass that looked hand-blown. The stopper was crystal, faceted to catch light, and the label was handwritten in the same elegant script as the address. Consolamentum. She didn't speak Latin, but the word felt weighted. Important. Consolation, perhaps. Comfort. Against every instinct that told her not to open packages from unknown sources, Margot pulled, the stopper free. The scent that rose from the bottle was extraordinary, not overwhelming, not cloying, but complex in a way that made her close her eyes and breathe deeply. Jasmine, yes, but underneath something darker, amber maybe, or sandalwood. And beneath that, notes she couldn't name, but that made her think of her mother's garden in Oakland, of summer evenings before everything changed, of a version of herself that had believed the world was fundamentally safe. She touched the stopper to her wrist, just a trace of the perfume against her pulse point. The scent bloomed against her skin, shifting as her body heat activated different notes. For the first time in months, the constant tension she carried in her shoulders released slightly. The tightness in her chest that had become so familiar she'd stopped noticing it eased just enough for her to take a full breath. Margot stood in her kitchen, holding the bottle, feeling something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten its name. Peace. She wore the perfume to work the next morning. 3 people commented on it before noon. "You smell amazing," said Keisha, her supervisor, pausing by Margot's cubicle with the particular expression of someone about to assign additional cases. "What is that?" "Just something I'm trying," Margot said, and Keisha moved on, without adding to her caseload, which was notable enough that Margot replayed the interaction twice in her mind. By evening, she'd reapplied the perfume 4 times, touching the stopper to her wrists and the hollow of her throat. Each application brought that same loosening, that same sense of being held by something gentle and implacable. Her last client of the day was Marcus Chen, a 16-year-old whose case file documented 3 foster homes in 2 years and a pattern of violent outbursts that had escalated since his biological mother's overdose. He'd been hostile in every previous session, refusing to make eye contact, responding to questions with elaborate silence. But today, Marcus had talked. Not about anything important. Video games mostly, and a teacher who let him eat lunch in the art room. But he'd talked for the full hour, and when the session ended, he'd looked at Margot and said, "Same time next week?" She nodded, not trusting herself to speak around the unexpected tightness in her throat. That night, she dreamed of her mother's garden, not as it existed now, overgrown and wild, the house in Oakland sold to pay for memory care, but as it had been when Margot was 12. Her mother kneeling among the roses, hands deep in dark soil, explaining the difference between hybrid teas and climbing varieties. The dream was so vivid she could smell the roses, could feel the summer heat on her arms, could hear her mother's voice with perfect clarity. She woke feeling rested for the first time in months. By Friday, the bottle was half empty. Margot applied the perfume in the morning, at lunch, before evening sessions. The effect was cumulative. Each application seemed to last longer, to sink deeper. Her anxiety, which had been a constant companion since her mother's diagnosis, had dulled to a distant murmur. The insomnia that had plagued her for 2 years simply vanished. She slept deeply, dreamlessly, waking each morning to an apartment that felt less like a cell and more like a refuge. Her supervisor commented on her improved demeanor. Her clients responded with unusual openness. Even her apartment seemed different. The sounds from neighboring units less intrusive. The light through her windows softer and more forgiving. On Saturday morning, she called her mother's nursing home. She'd been avoiding the visits, spacing them further apart as her mother's condition deteriorated. The last time she'd gone, 3 weeks ago, her mother had looked at her with the polite blankness reserved for strangers and asked when her daughter was coming. Margot had left after 15 minutes, sitting in her car in the parking lot until she could breathe normally again. But Saturday, wearing the perfume, she drove to Oakland. Her mother was in the common room, staring at a television showing a cooking competition. Margot sat beside her, not expecting recognition, but needing to be present anyway. Her mother turned to her. For a moment, less than a heartbeat, something flickered in her eyes. Not quite recognition, but awareness. A seeing that had been absent for months. "Margot," her mother said. The word was slightly slurred, but unmistakable. "You smell like home." Margot felt something crack open in her chest. She stayed for 3 hours. Her mother drifted in and out of lucidity, but there were moments, brief, precious, when she was fully present. She asked about Margot's work. She mentioned the roses, whether anyone was caring for them. She said she was tired, so tired, and Margot held her hand and said she knew she understood. Driving back to San Francisco, Margot cried for the first time since the diagnosis. Not the angry, frustrated tears that came in therapy, but something deeper. A grief that had been waiting for permission to emerge. The bottle was nearly empty by Sunday. She tried to use it sparingly, dabbing it on with increasing care, but the effect was diminishing. The peace that had come so easily at first now required more frequent applications. By evening, she could barely smell it on her skin, and the anxiety was creeping back, sharper than before, as if it had been gathering strength during its absence. Monday morning, the bottle was empty. Margot held it up to the light, tilting it, hoping for a last drop. Nothing. The crystal stopper was dry. The dark glass showed no trace of the liquid that had transformed her week. She went to work without it and felt immediately raw, exposed. The office fluorescence seemed too bright. Keisha's voice, discussing caseload redistribution, grated against her nerves. Marcus Chen was sullen and silent again, refusing to meet her eyes. And when she asked how his week had been, he told her to go to hell. By noon, her hands were shaking. By evening, she developed a headache that felt like her skull was too small for her brain. She left work early, drove home through rush hour traffic that seemed personally designed to torment her, and sat in her apartment staring at the empty bottle. The brown paper wrapping was still in her recycling bin. She pulled it out, searching for any clue about the sender. No stamp. No postmark. Hand-delivered then. But by whom? She'd lived in this building for 4 years and barely knew her neighbors beyond polite nods in the hallway. She tried searching online. Consolamentum perfume. The results talked about medieval Cathar rituals, about comfort given to the dying, about a final blessing before death. Nothing about perfume, nothing that explained where the bottle had come from or how to get more. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay in bed watching the ceiling and feeling her anxiety rebuild itself brick by brick. Every sound in the building was a threat. Every passing car outside suggested danger. Her mother's face floated in her mind, that moment of recognition already feeling like something she'd imagined. Tuesday morning, there was another package outside her door. Margot stood in her doorway in pajamas at 6 a.m., looking down at the brown paper wrapping, the familiar, elegant script. Her name, no return address. She could smell it through the paper. That sweet, complex scent that promised relief. She should have walked away. Should have called the police, reported the packages. Should have done anything except what she did, which was bring it inside with trembling hands and tear open the wrapping like someone dying of thirst. The bottle was identical to the first. Dark glass, crystal stopper, handwritten label, consolamentum. She opened it immediately, applied it liberally, breathing in the scent like oxygen. The relief was instantaneous and total. The headache vanished. The tension dissolved. The world softened its edges. She called in sick to work, which she never did, and spent the day in a state of profound calm, doing nothing more strenuous than sitting by her window watching the street below. People walked past with their burdens, briefcases and backpacks, worried expressions, phones pressed to ears. They looked so small, so trapped in their tiny concerns. She felt immense, expanded beyond the boundaries of her body, connected to something vast and infinitely patient. The second bottle lasted 3 days. On Friday, a third bottle arrived. Margot stopped going to work, stopped answering her phone. Her supervisor left voicemails, first concerned, then irritated, then formal. If we don't hear from you by Monday, we'll have to consider this job abandonment. She deleted them without listening to the full messages. The bottles kept arriving every 3 days, like clockwork. She stopped wondering where they came from. It didn't matter. What mattered was the perfume, the relief, the way it held her anxiety at a distance where it couldn't touch her. She also stopped visiting her mother, stopped leaving her apartment entirely except to bring in the packages. Food seemed unnecessary. Sleep came in brief, deep patches. Her body felt light, insubstantial, as if she were slowly becoming something else. Something that didn't need the usual maintenance of living. Dr. Kane called, left a message. "Margot, I'm concerned. Please call me back. We can talk about what you're avoiding. We can work through this." But Margot wasn't avoiding anything anymore. She was facing something directly, letting it consume her, and the sensation was not terror, but profound relief. The perfume's effects were changing. The peace was deeper now, more complete. She could sit for hours without moving, barely breathing, feeling her consciousness expand and dilate until the boundaries between herself and the apartment blurred. The walls were breathing with her. The floors hummed with a frequency that matched her heartbeat. The building itself had become an extension of her nervous system, and she was starting to understand what the perfume was doing. Not masking her anxiety, not treating it, replacing it. Replacing her slowly and systematically with something that didn't need to be afraid because it didn't need to be anything at all. The 9th bottle arrived on a Tuesday, exactly 3 weeks after the first. Margot brought it inside and set it on her counter next to the 8 empty bottles she'd arranged in a neat row. She looked at them for a long time, these dark glass containers that had held her transformation. Then she opened the 9th bottle and poured it down the sink. The scent rose up as it drained away, thick and cloying, and for a moment the entire apartment was saturated with it. Margot breathed it in, this last concentrated dose, and felt something shift. Not relief this time, recognition. She looked down at her hands and saw they were translucent, the bones showing through skin that had thinned to the consistency of paper. Her reflection in the kitchen window showed a face that was becoming smooth, featureless, as if someone were slowly erasing her details. The panic she should have felt was distant, happening to someone else, someone who still believed she had choices. The 10th bottle arrived the next morning. Margot looked at it from where she sat on her kitchen floor, her back against the cabinets. She'd been sitting there for hours, watching the light change through her window, feeling her body settle into stillness. The package sat in the doorway where it had been pushed through the mail slot she hadn't realized could accommodate packages that size. She didn't open it. She couldn't remember how to stand, how to move across space. Those skills belonged to a version of herself that had required mobility, had places to go, people to see, a life to maintain. The 11th bottle arrived 3 days later. Then the 12th. They accumulated in her doorway, brown paper packages with her name in elegant script, each one emitting that sweet, complex scent that no longer promised relief, but simply was, like the air itself, like existence. Margot sat on her kitchen floor and became very still. Her breath slowed, her heartbeat diminished to a whisper, and in the growing silence, she finally understood what the perfume had been from the beginning. Not a gift, but a bridge. Not comfort, but transformation. Not life, but something that looked like life if you didn't examine it too closely. On the day the building manager finally used his key to check on her, after neighbors complained about the smell, he found 14 unopened packages in the doorway, and a dark stain on the kitchen floor in roughly the shape of a sitting figure. The stain smelled sweet, complex, with notes of jasmine and amber and something darker he couldn't name. It wouldn't come out no matter what cleaning products he used. Eventually, they tore up the floorboards and replaced them, but the apartment stayed empty for 2 years because the smell persisted, seeping up from whatever was beneath. And every few months, packages still arrived. Brown paper, elegant script, no return address. The new tenant, when one finally agreed to take the apartment at a reduced rate, brought them inside without question. The first bottle lasted a week. The second lasted 3 days. By the third, she'd stopped going to work, stopped answering her phone, stopped doing anything but waiting for the next delivery. The building manager learned to look away when he saw the packages. Some things he'd discovered were easier to ignore than to understand. And the scent in the hallways, jasmine and amber and something darker, had become so familiar he barely noticed it anymore, even as it slowly saturated the walls, the floors, the very structure of the building, patient and eternal, and always waiting for someone desperate enough to breathe it in. Story 2. The first time Silas Merrick saw the figure standing at the tree line, he was 7 days into his posting at the Hargrove estate, and beginning to understand that caretaking meant something different in winter than it did in his imagination. The estate sat on 43 acres in the Catskills, 2 hours north of New York City, in a region where money went to hide from itself. Silas was 62, recently retired from a career in municipal management that had left him with a pension barely adequate, and a restlessness that his wife, Carol, had found increasingly difficult to tolerate. When she'd suggested a trial separation in November, suggested it over coffee, calmly, as if they were discussing a minor repair, Silas had applied for the caretaker position the same day. The Hargrove estate needed someone from December through March, when the family retreated to their Florida compound, and the house required a living presence to prevent the particular decay that came from wealthy structures being left alone in mountain winters. The job description had made it sound almost romantic. Maintain the boilers, check for ice dams, ensure pipes didn't freeze, report any issues to property management. Room and board provided, solitude guaranteed. What the description hadn't mentioned was how the house felt at 3 in the morning when ice settled in the eaves with sounds like footsteps, or how the windows, all 47 of them, seemed to watch the grounds with something approaching attention, or how the woods that pressed against the estate on 3 sides had a quality of density that went beyond mere trees, as if the forest itself were a solid mass barely constrained by the spaces between trunks. The figure appeared on the 7th night, standing perhaps 200 yards from the house at the edge of where the manicured lawn surrendered to wilderness. Silas saw it through the library window while making his evening rounds. Just a shape, human-sized, motionless in the dusk, that came early at this latitude in January. He stood watching it for 5 minutes, his hand on the window frame, feeling the cold radiating through the glass. The figure didn't move, didn't raise an arm in greeting or turn away, simply stood at the threshold between maintained ground and forest, dark against the snow, existing without apparent purpose. Silas told himself it was a tree stump, a trick of the failing light, the kind of visual error that came from spending too much time alone. He finished his rounds, checking thermostats, ensuring the 3rd floor hallway radiator wasn't leaking, confirming all exterior doors were locked, and when he returned to the library an hour later, the figure was gone. He didn't think about it again until the next night, when it appeared in the same location at the same time, This time, Silas watched it for longer, his breath fogging the cold window glass. The figure stood with a stillness that seemed deliberate, performative, the posture of something maintaining a position rather than simply existing in space. As darkness fell completely, it became indistinguishable from the shadows of the trees, and when Silas turned on the exterior floodlights, he saw only forest and the churned snow where deer had been foraging near the tree line. On the 10th night, the figure was closer. Not dramatically so, but measurably. Perhaps 150 yards from the house, standing just outside the reach of the floodlights. Silas stared at it until his eyes watered, trying to discern details. Height, build, whether it was facing the house or standing in profile. But the darkness was absolute, and the figure existed as a void within it, a man-shaped absence that suggested form without revealing it. Silas considered calling property management. But what would he say? That someone was standing in the woods at dusk? That they weren't trespassing, technically, since the estate's property line ended 50 feet into the forest? That he felt watched but had no evidence beyond a shape that might be a person or might be nothing at all? He checked the estate's security system instead. 12 cameras covered the grounds, their feeds displayed on a monitor in the mudroom. He scrolled through the footage from the past 10 days, watching accelerated versions of himself moving through empty rooms, of snow falling in the courtyard, of nothing whatsoever happening at the tree line during the hours when the figure appeared. The cameras, apparently, saw nothing. On the 14th night, Silas stood at the library window with the lights behind him dimmed and watched the figure stand at what he estimated was 100 yards. Close enough now that he should have been able to see details. Clothing, posture, whether it was facing him. But the darkness seemed to pool around it with unusual density, as if the figure generated its own shadow. He turned off the interior lights completely. The figure remained visible as a darker darkness, a negative space in the already substantial dark of winter woods. Silas's reflection in the window glass was faint, ghostly, superimposed over the view. For a moment, in the way reflections sometimes align, the figure appeared to be standing behind him, inside the room. He spun around, hard hammering, and found the library empty. When he looked back outside, the figure had moved. Not closer to the house, but to the left, perhaps 30 feet, as if it had circled while his attention was diverted. The movement suggested intelligence, suggested intention, suggested awareness of where Silas stood, and when he was looking. He called Carol that night, breaking their agreed-upon communication boundary. She answered after 4 rings, her voice carrying the particular wariness of someone expecting bad news. "Silas, is everything all right?" He opened his mouth to tell her about the figure, about the feeling of being watched, about the wrongness of the past 2 weeks. Instead, he heard himself say, "I'm fine. Just wanted to hear your voice." A pause. "It's after 11. I know, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have called." Another pause. He could hear television in the background, the murmur of voices from whatever show she was watching in her living room. "The separation was your idea too, Silas. You agreed it was necessary." Had he? He remembered Carol's careful presentation, her reasons delivered like a professional assessment. He remembered nodding, feeling a strange relief that someone was finally naming the distance that had grown between them. He didn't remember agreeing so much as not objecting. "You're right," he said. "I'll let you go." After hanging up, he stood in the estate's kitchen. Granite counters, professional grade, appliances that gleamed with disuse, and felt the weight of the house around him. 14 rooms, most of them closed off for the winter, accumulating cold like sediment. He was living in perhaps 3 rooms total: the bedroom, the kitchen, and the library, where he spent his evenings pretending to read books from the Hargrove family's collection of leather-bound volumes no one had opened in decades. The figure appeared every night for the next week, each night measurably closer. By day 21, it stood at what Silas estimated was 50 yards from the house, just beyond the circular driveway. Close enough that he should have been able to see features, should have been able to determine gender and age, and whether this was someone who needed help or someone who meant harm. But the figure remained indistinct, shrouded in darkness that didn't match the ambient light levels. It stood with that same terrible patience, and Silas stood at the library window matching it. Both of them motionless, both of them watching, engaged in some transaction whose terms he didn't understand. He tried walking outside. On the 24th night, he put on his winter coat and boots and stepped out the front door with a flashlight heavy enough to serve as a weapon. The cold was immediate and comprehensive, the kind of mountain winter cold that bypassed clothing and went straight for bone. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating snow and the skeletal trees beyond the lawn. The figure was gone. Silas walked toward where it had been standing, his boots crunching through the crusted snow. He reached the spot. He was certain it was the correct spot, and found nothing. No footprints, no disturbance in the snow, no evidence that anyone had stood there except his own growing conviction that they had. He swept his flashlight beam through the trees, searching for movement or retreat. The forest absorbed the light without echo. Darkness so complete it seemed active, pressing, and then, from perhaps 30 feet to his left, he heard breathing. Not heavy breathing, not labored or excited, just the quiet rhythm of respiration, human-paced, close enough that if there had been light, he would have been able to see who it belonged to. Silas spun, flashlight beam following his movement. Nothing, but the breathing continued, circling him now, maintaining distance but clearly present, clearly real. His own breathing accelerated, creating counterpoint rhythm. The two of them, he and whatever stood in the darkness just beyond sight, breathing together, connected by this most basic biological function. "Who's there?" His voice cracked, shattered the silence into fragments. "What do you want?" The breathing stopped. Silas stood in the snow 30 yards from the house, from light and warmth and locked doors, and understood with sudden clarity that he'd made an error, that going outside had been precisely the wrong choice, that the figure hadn't wanted him to leave the house. It had wanted him to try. He walked backward toward the estate, not running but moving with deliberate speed, his flashlight beam jerking across trees and snow and nothing whatsoever. The breathing didn't resume, but he felt a tension on him, focused and absolute. He reached the front door and fumbled with the handle. His hands were shaking, fingers numb from cold or fear, and finally got it open. Inside, he locked the door, shot the deadbolt, and slid the chain into place. Then he stood with his back against the wood, breathing hard, watching condensation from his breath fog the air in the unheated foyer. Through the narrow window beside the door, he could see the driveway, the lawn, the tree line, and standing exactly where it had always stood, visible once more in the darkness, the figure waited. After that night, Silas stopped trying to see it clearly. He accepted its presence the way he'd learned to accept other aspects of the estate. The sounds in the walls, the way certain doors wouldn't stay closed, the persistent smell of flowers in the second-floor hallway, though it was January and no flowers bloomed anywhere in the house. The figure appeared at dusk, visible from the library window, gradually closer, night by night, patient as erosion. By the end of February, it stood in the courtyard, close enough now that Silas should have seen features, clothing, whether it carried anything in hands that surely must have been frozen. But the darkness that clung to it remained absolute, and Silas had stopped turning on the exterior lights or attempting investigation. He simply watched from the library as the figure watched back, engaged in some dance whose steps he was learning without ever having been taught. Carol called on the 1st of March. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice careful. "Maybe the separation isn't working. Maybe we should talk about trying again." Silas stood in the kitchen, with the phone pressed to his ear, looking toward the library, where he knew if he walked to the window, he would see the figure standing 20 feet from the glass. "I don't think that's a good idea," he heard himself say. "Silas, I'm different now. I wouldn't be good for you." "That's what I'm saying. We're both different. We could be different together." But Silas understood something Carol didn't. The figure wasn't coming for him out of malice. It was coming because he'd invited it, because he'd spent 62 years performing a life that required constant maintenance. The marriage, the job, the performance of normalcy, and now, alone in these mountains, he'd finally stopped performing. The figure was simply filling the space his authentic self had vacated decades ago. "I need to go," he said. "Silas, please." He hung up. Then he walked to the library and stood at the window. The figure was there, closer than it had ever been. Close enough that if there had been light, if it hadn't been shrouded in that absolute darkness, he might have seen its face. Close enough that he realized, looking at its proportions and its height, and the particular way it held itself, that he was looking at himself. Not a reflection, not a doppelganger, but the version of himself that he'd been slowly killing for 40 years. The self that had wanted something other than municipal management, that had felt trapped by marriage and routine, that had looked at the safe choices he'd made and felt a growing rage that had nowhere to go except inward. The figure raised one hand slowly, deliberately, and placed it flat against the glass. Silas raised his own hand and matched the gesture, palm to palm, with only the window between them. The glass was very cold. He could feel the chill radiating through it, could feel his hand going numb, and then, so gradually he couldn't identify the exact moment it happened, he felt warmth instead. Not heat from the figure's hand, but warmth from his own body draining away, flowing out through his palm into the waiting presence on the other side. He knew he should step back, should break contact, should call for help even though there was no one to call. But the sensation was not unpleasant. It felt like relief, like the burden of being Silas Merrick, dutiful husband, competent manager, man who maintained expectations, was lifting. He stood with his palm against the glass as winter night settled completely around the estate, and let himself drain away into the darkness he'd been building all his life. The figure absorbed him steadily, patiently, the way good earth absorbs rain. And when the estate manager arrived 3 weeks later to prepare for the family's return, he found the house in perfect condition, all systems functional, all rooms clean and properly maintained. And in the library, Standing at the window with one hand pressed against the glass, a figure that might have been the caretaker if you didn't look too closely. The estate manager looked, saw the stillness that wasn't quite right, the darkness that seemed to pool around the standing form, the quality of presence without personhood. He backed out of the room carefully, locked the library door, and called the family to suggest they hire a different caretaker next winter. But by then, the figure had stopped standing at the window. It had begun making rounds, checking thermostats, ensuring radiators weren't leaking, confirming all exterior doors were locked. The dutiful performance of maintaining a wealthy structure through seasons of absence. And if someone were to stand outside the estate at dusk and look toward the library window, they might see another figure beginning to form at the tree line, patient and waiting. The inevitable presence that comes for anyone who spends too long pretending they're someone they're not. The woods have always been good at collecting what people abandon. And the Hargrove estate, with its 47 watching windows, has always needed caretakers who understand that some maintenance requires sacrifice. Requires the slow, willing surrender of the self you built for others. Until all that remains is the shape you make. In the darkness, waiting. Story 3. The call came on Thursday while Dashiell Thorne was cataloging the Henderson Estate's third-floor storage, his hands deep in a box of someone's carefully preserved correspondence from the 1940s. Mr. Thorne, this is Pamela Grissom. You submitted an inquiry about my grandmother's recipe box. Dashiell straightened too quickly, his 54-year-old back protesting the abrupt movement. He'd submitted the inquiry 3 weeks ago after finding a reference to the Grissom recipes in a food history journal. Had almost forgotten about it. Mrs. Grissom, yes. Thank you for getting back to me. I'm working on a project about regional cooking traditions, and your grandmother's collection came highly recommended. Came recommended by whom? She's been dead since 1989. Fair question. By Dr. Walters at the Historical Society. She mentioned your grandmother was known locally for certain specialized recipes. A long silence. Dashiell pressed the phone closer. Heard what might have been breathing or static. Then, you can come look at it. But I don't want money. I want you to take it away. The whole thing. And you can't bring it back. Once you leave with it, it's yours. Agreed? This was unusual enough that Dashiell should have questioned it. Should have asked why someone would give away what sounded like a valuable culinary archive. Instead, he said, agreed. Mrs. Grissom lived in a ranch house outside of Fredericksburg, Virginia, the kind of 60s construction that had been built affordable and aged into merely old. She met him at the door, a woman in her 70s with silver hair cut short and efficient, wearing a cardigan despite the August heat. You're the historian, she said. Not a question. I specialize in material culture, objects that tell us how people live their daily lives. She studied his face for a long moment, seemed to find whatever she was looking for, and gestured him inside. The house smelled of instant coffee and carpet that had been shampooed recently. Everything was very clean, very neutral, the kind of deliberate blandness that spoke of someone trying very hard to make a space forgettable. The recipe box sat on the kitchen table, wooden, hand-carved, perhaps 8 inches square, dark walnut, the kind that suggested quality craftsmanship from an era when objects were made to last. The lid was inlaid with what looked like mother-of-pearl, forming a pattern Dashiell couldn't quite parse. My grandmother, Iris Grissom, was a home economist, Mrs. Grissom said, not touching the box, not getting within 3 feet of it. Worked for the Agricultural Extension Service, taught women in rural communities how to preserve food, stretch rations during the war, make do with less. Very practical woman, very scientific in her approach. Dashiell reached for the box, noted Mrs. Grissom's sharp intake of breath. The wood was cool under his fingers, almost cold despite the stuffy warmth of the kitchen. "May I open it?" "I'd rather you didn't. Not here. Take it home. Look through it there. Just..." She paused, her hands twisting together in her lap. "Just don't call me about it. Don't ask questions. Don't try to return it. Agreed. Mrs. Grissom, is there something I should know about this collection? If there is, you'll figure it out on your own. I won't talk about it. My daughter tried to burn it twice. Both times, the fire went out the moment she put it in the flames. My husband wanted to throw it in the river. He carried it down to the dock, and when he tried to let go, his hands wouldn't open. He stood there for an hour trying to release it, before he finally brought it back to the house." Dashiell's scholarly instincts should have been waving red flags, should have been triggering every warning about handling objects with complicated histories. Instead, he felt excitement building in his chest. Objects that resisted disposal always had stories attached to them. Those stories were his profession. "I'll take it," he said. Mrs. Grissom's shoulders slumped with visible relief. "Thank you," she said, and the gratitude in her voice was so profound, it made Dashiell uncomfortable. She walked him to his car, watched him place the box on the passenger seat, and as he pulled away, he saw her in the rearview mirror standing in her driveway with her hands pressed together like prayer, getting smaller and smaller until distance erased her completely. He waited until he was home, in his study with its careful lighting and archival supplies, before opening the box properly. His apartment in Arlington was small, cluttered with the accumulation of a career spent studying other people's possessions. Books covered every wall, file boxes were stacked in corners. His ex-wife, during their last argument before she'd moved out, had called it a tomb disguised as scholarship. The recipe box opened easily, the hinges smooth and silent. Inside were index cards, perhaps 200 of them, organized with colored dividers. Dashiell lifted the first section, appetizers, and began reading. The handwriting was precise, each letter carefully formed in fountain pen ink that had faded to brown. The recipes themselves were standard for the era. Deviled eggs, cheese straws, cream cheese pinwheels. Nothing unusual. He moved to the next section, soups. Here, things became interesting. The recipes were still recognizable, chicken noodle, vegetable beef, but the instructions included additional steps. Stir clockwise 3 times while thinking of someone you wish to nourish. Add salt in small pinches, counting backward from 13. Serve in white bowls, never blue. Dashiell recognized what he was looking at. Kitchen superstitions, folk practices that had been common in rural communities, especially in Appalachian and Southern foodways, perfectly normal for someone of Iris Grissom's generation. The kind of thing that gave material culture historians like himself genuine insight into lived experience. He continued reading. Casseroles, vegetables, breads. Each section contained increasingly elaborate instructions that went beyond cooking technique into something else. Ritual, perhaps, or ceremony. Knead the dough while naming each family member you wish to bind to your table. Let rise in darkness, covered with a cloth that has touched each person's sleeping form. Then he reached the divider marked remedies. The recipes here weren't food exactly, though they involved preparation in the kitchen. tisanes, poultices, tinctures. Each one was labeled with a purpose: for heartbreak, for betrayal, for restoring what was stolen, for making someone see truth, for making someone forget. The instructions grew more specific. Collect hair from the one you wish to influence. Burn it to ash. Mix with elderberry juice. Serve in morning coffee without their knowledge. Grind photographs into powder using a mortar blessed by... The handwriting became harder to read here. The ink smeared as if Iris Grissom's hand had been trembling. Dashiell set that card aside and reached for the next. For binding, take a lock of your own hair and a lock of theirs. Braid them together while speaking their full name 9 times. Bury the braid beneath your doorstep. They will be unable to leave you. He felt something cold settle in his stomach. The next divider was labeled in different ink. Darker, more recent, final recipes. The handwriting had changed. Shakier, less controlled. The cards here were dated, spanning from 1983 to 1988, the year before Iris Grissom died. The first one read, "When nothing else works, when they've left and no remedy brings them back, when you understand you've become the thing that drives people away." The recipe that followed was not for cooking. It was instructions for something else entirely. Something that involved specific words repeated in darkness. Specific objects buried in specific patterns, specific intentions held with absolute focus. Dashiell read it twice, his hands going numb around the card. Then he read the note at the bottom. This worked. Harold came back. But he's wrong now. His eyes don't focus right. He moves like someone remembering how to walk. He speaks, but the words are delayed like an echo of himself. I've undone this 3 times, but I can't undo completely. What comes back isn't what left. The remaining cards in the final recipes section were variations on the first, each one more desperate, each one documenting Iris Grissom's attempts to reverse what she'd done. The last card was dated 2 weeks before her obituary. Dashiell had looked it up after Mrs. Grissom's call. For releasing what should not have been bound, prepare at midnight. 3 white candles, salt in circles. Say their name backward 9 times. Then say, I release you to wherever you should have gone. I release myself from the wanting that kept you here. I release us both from the binding. Below this, in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible. Didn't work. H still here. Still wrong. Going to try something else. If you're reading this, I'm sorry. Don't use these recipes. Don't think you can control the outcome. Wanting someone is not the same as loving them. And binding them to you is not the same as keeping them. What you make stay becomes a ghost of itself. What you make return comes back wrong. Dashiell set the box aside and sat in his study as evening darkened his windows. He should have felt scholarly excitement. He should have been planning how to contextualize this, how to write it up for publication, how to present these recipes as evidence of a fascinating intersection between folk practice and genuine belief. Instead, he thought about his ex-wife, Amanda, who had left him 3 years ago, not in a dramatic scene, but in a slow exhaustion, packing her things over a weekend while he was at a conference, leaving a note that said only, I can't compete with dead people's possessions for your attention anymore. He'd tried to call her perhaps 50 times in the first month, had driven by her new apartment twice before recognizing the behavior as stalking and forcing himself to stop, had written letters he'd never sent, imagining scenarios where she realized she'd made a mistake, where she came back, but she hadn't come back, and eventually he'd stopped expecting her to, had settled into the particular loneliness of someone who'd chosen objects over people. and now lived surrounded by the evidence of his choice. Dashiell looked at the recipe box sitting on his desk, at the cards that promised influence, control, return, at the desperate instructions of a woman who'd loved someone enough to trap them, who'd learned too late that what you trap stops being what you loved. He should burn it, should follow the impulse that Mrs. Grissom's daughter and husband had both felt, should destroy these instructions before someone else tried to use them. Before he tried to use them. But he was a historian. His job was preservation, not destruction. His responsibility was to future scholarship, to maintaining records of how people lived and what they believed and what they were willing to do when love or loneliness pushed them past reason. He photographed every card, front and back, his hands steady and professional, logged them in his database, prepared them for archival storage in acid-free sleeves. He did this work efficiently, methodically, not letting himself reread the recipes, not letting himself imagine what might happen if he followed those instructions, not letting himself think about Amanda's number still in his phone, about her hair still in the brush in his bathroom 3 years later, because he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. He finished the documentation after midnight and packed the box carefully into a storage container with appropriate desiccants and cushioning. Tomorrow he would take it to the climate-controlled unit where he kept his most sensitive acquisitions, where it would sit with the letters and photographs and journals of people long dead, preserved for scholars who would never arrive, maintained with a care that substituted for connection. But that night, alone in his study with just a desk lamp burning, Dashiell pulled out the card labeled for returning what was lost. Read it once more, slowly, memorizing the steps even as he told himself he wouldn't use them, even as he told himself he was better than Iris Grissom, that he understood the difference between wanting and having, between love and possession, even as he went to the bathroom and retrieved Amanda's hair from the brush he'd kept like a shrine. The recipe was very specific about timing, about materials, about intention. It required 3 nights of preparation, specific words spoken in specific patterns, hair braided with thread stolen from something the person had worn. Dashiell had all of these things, had kept them, curated them, the way he kept everything that mattered to him, preserved but untouched, cataloged but never truly connected to. He began the preparations telling himself he was just testing the process, just documenting from a researcher's perspective, telling himself he would stop before the final step, before the binding became permanent, telling himself lies that sounded almost true when spoken aloud to an empty apartment at 3 a.m. On the 3rd night, he completed the ritual, spoke Amanda's name backward 9 times, buried the braided hair beneath his doorstep as instructed, waited. Nothing happened. Of course, nothing happened. These were folk practices, superstitions, the desperate actions of people who didn't understand that loss was final, that some doors once closed couldn't be reopened. Dashiell went to bed feeling foolish and relieved in equal measure. The knock came at 7 a.m. He woke to it, disoriented, stumbled to the door in his bathrobe. Through the peephole, he saw Amanda. His hand was on the lock before he could think. Then he paused, pressed his eye closer to the peephole. She stood in the hallway with the stillness that wasn't quite right, her head tilted at an angle that suggested the neck had lost some essential tension. Her eyes were open, but didn't seem to be looking at anything, focused on some distance that had nothing to do with doors or walls. "Amanda," his voice cracked. She didn't respond, didn't knock again, just stood there, waiting. Dashiell backed away from the door, his heart hammering. This wasn't real. This was guilt, made visual loneliness, creating hallucinations. He waited for 5 minutes, then looked through the peephole again. She was still there, still motionless, still wrong. He grabbed his phone, pulled up her number, called it, heard ringing on the other side of the door, watched through the peephole as the figure that looked like Amanda didn't move, didn't reach for a phone, didn't react to the sound coming from somewhere in her vicinity. He hung up. The ringing stopped. The figure remained. For 3 days, Amanda stood in his hallway. She didn't knock again, didn't move. Neighbors walking past her didn't seem to see her. Or if they did, they didn't stop, didn't question why a woman would stand motionless outside his door for days at a time. Dashiell stopped leaving his apartment, ordered food for delivery, left instructions to leave it in the hallway. Each time he opened the door to retrieve it, she was there, standing in the exact same position, wearing the same clothes, her eyes focused on nothing. On the 4th day, he called the number Mrs. Grissom had given him, despite her explicit instruction not to. It rang 14 times before she answered. "I told you not to call," she said immediately. It worked. The recipe, the binding, it worked. Silence. Then, "What did you bind?" "My ex-wife. She's here, but she's wrong, exactly like your grandmother wrote. She won't move, won't respond, just stands there. I warned you. I need to know how to undo it. Your grandmother's reversal instructions, do they work?" More silence. Dashiell could hear Mrs. Grissom breathing, could hear the decades of weight she carried in that sound. "My grandfather," she said finally, "the herald in those recipes. He died in 1994, 5 years after my grandmother. But Mrs. Thorne, he's still in my mother's house, still wrong, still bound. The reversal didn't work because what you bind stops being the person. It becomes a thing shaped like them, animated by your need, trapped between leaving and staying. How do I? You can't. Once you bind them, they're bound. Not to you exactly, but to the wanting itself. They'll stay until the want dies completely, until you truly, genuinely no longer need them there. I don't need her there. I just wanted, Mr. Thorne, the recipe doesn't care what you wanted. It responds to what you need. And if you needed her back badly enough to do this, then you need her more than you realize. She'll stand there until that changes. Until you change." Mrs. Grissom hung up. Dashiell stood at his door for a long time, looking through the peephole at what he'd made. Amanda wasn't in his hallway. The thing shaped like Amanda was. The manifestation of his inability to let go, of his preference for objects over people, of his need to possess and preserve rather than love and release. He opened the door. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. He reached out slowly and touched its shoulder. The surface felt wrong. Not flesh, not quite solid, but something in between. The figure that had been Amanda tilted its head toward him with a movement that was delayed, mechanical, like a puppet remembering its cues. "I'm sorry," Dashiell said. It didn't respond. He hadn't expected it to. He left the door open and went back to his study, to his careful cataloging and his preservation of other people's lives. Behind him, he could feel it standing in his doorway, could feel the weight of what he'd done, the thing he'd created from loneliness and ritual, and the human need to control what cannot be controlled. Eventually, he supposed, he would stop needing it, would finally release whatever want kept it there. But he'd spent 54 years building a life around possession and preservation, and he understood with cold clarity that change came slowly, if it came at all. The figure waited. Dashiell worked, and in its box on his shelf, Iris Grissom's recipe collection sat preserved for future scholars who would read it and think they understood, who would treat it as evidence of folklore and belief without understanding that some recipes work precisely as advertised, that some bindings hold, that some wants are stronger than death and turn love into haunting. Outside his door, the thing that had been summoned by 3 nights of desperate ritual stood patient as stone, and would stand there until Dashiell learned the difference between keeping and letting go. And in that hallway filled with the mundane sounds of other people's ordinary lives, it waited with the terrible patience of anything that has been bound against its nature, that has been made to return when it should have been allowed to leave, that has become a monument to someone else's inability to be alone. Story 4. The highway had been empty for 43 miles when Everett Blackwood saw the lights of the rest stop emerge from the darkness like something rising from deep water. It was 3:18 in the morning, and he'd been driving for 6 hours, hauling refrigerated pharmaceuticals from Atlanta to Memphis on a route he'd driven perhaps 500 times in his 22 years of long-haul trucking. The road should have been familiar enough to navigate half asleep, and maybe he was half asleep because he didn't remember seeing any signs indicating a rest stop in this section of I-40. But there it was, sodium vapor lights creating islands of yellow-orange in the vast darkness. The standard Tennessee dock building with its low profile and concrete construction, the truck parking area with its painted lines, and the familiar bulk of several 18-wheelers already parked for the night. Everett needed coffee, needed to stretch his legs, needed, more pressingly, a bathroom. He signaled right, though there was no one behind him to see it, a habit so ingrained it was muscle memory, and pulled into the lot. The building looked standard, weathered concrete, narrow windows with metal grating, the kind of brutalist architecture that made every rest stop in America interchangeable. Everett parked in the truck lot, killed his engine, and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. His CB radio was quiet. No chatter, no drivers trading information about speed traps or weather conditions, just static that sounded almost like breathing. He grabbed his thermos and his wallet and climbed down from the cab. The air was warmer than expected, muggy with humidity that suggested rain but delivered only stillness. Above him, the sky was cloudy, no stars visible, no moon, just darkness layered on darkness. The other trucks in the lot showed no signs of life, no lights in their cabs, no idling engines. Everett walked toward the building, noting details without quite registering them. The cleanliness of the parking lot, the absence of the usual litter that accumulated at rest stops, the way his footsteps seemed muffled, absorbed by air too thick to carry sound properly. But sake, doors opened automatically. He stepped into fluorescent brightness and the particular smell of industrial disinfectant that all rest stops shared. But underneath it, something else. Something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in warm storage. The bathrooms were to his left. The vending machines and tourist information straight ahead. The building appeared empty. Everett walked toward the bathroom, his boots squeaking on tiles so clean it looked wet. But when he touched the wall to steady himself, his hand came away dry. Inside the bathroom, he stood at the urinal and stared at the graffiti-free wall, thinking about how strange it was that this place showed no evidence of use. No paper towels on the floor, no water spots on the mirror, no smell of humanity concentrated in two small spaces. just that persistent scent of disinfectant covering something fouler. He washed his hands, watching his reflection in the mirror that was too clean, that reflected his face with the high-contrast sharpness of hospital lighting. He looked older than he remembered. 68 now, the skin on his face showing the kind of wear that came from decades of bad truck stop food and insufficient sleep, and the particular stress of being divorced twice and being estranged from a daughter who'd stopped returning his calls 3 years ago. He looked like a man who'd spent his life in transit and had nothing to show for it except the rig outside and a storage unit full of things he'd meant to deal with eventually. He turned off the water. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the normal silence of a late-night rest stop, but something deeper. Total. The kind of quiet that suggested the complete absence of anything beyond these walls. No highway traffic, no wind, no insects, no life. Everett walked back into the main area. The vending machines hummed, the only sound besides his footsteps. He approached them, studying the usual selection. Candy bars, chips, energy, drinks. The prices were wrong. Too low, 20 years out of date. A Snickers bar for 50 cents. A Coke for 75 cents. He must have been reading it wrong. He fed 2 quarters into the machine for coffee. The mechanism accepted them with a sound like swallowing, and a paper cup dropped into position, watched brown liquid flow into it with mechanical precision. The cup, when he retrieved it, was warm but not hot. The liquid inside looked like coffee but smelled vaguely medicinal, like aspirin dissolved in water. You might not want to drink that. Everett spun around, spilling coffee on his hand. A man stood near the tourist information rack, wearing a trucker's jacket and jeans, looking perhaps 50 years old, with gray stubble and the particular posture of someone whose back had been damaged by years of sitting wrong. He stood very still, watching Everett with eyes that didn't quite seem to focus. "Didn't see you come in," Everett said. "No one does. I didn't see myself come in, if that makes sense." Which it probably doesn't. The man's voice had the flat quality of someone reading from a script they'd memorized long ago. "What do you mean I shouldn't drink this?" The man tilted his head toward the bathroom. "You were in there maybe 3 minutes? Felt like 3 minutes." "Yeah, about that. Check your watch." Everett looked down at his wrist, at the trucker's watch his first wife had given him 40 years ago. Still running, still keeping time, even if nothing else in his life had endured. The display read 3:18 a.m. That was wrong. He'd checked his watch when he pulled in. 3:18. Now, after parking and using the bathroom and getting coffee, it should have been at least 3:30. But his watch insisted it was still 3:18. "Mine did that too," the man said. "Kept showing the same time over and over. Took me a while to understand what it meant." "Battery's probably dying," Everett said, but he could hear the doubt in his own voice. "Sure. Or you could look outside." Everett walked to the window. Beyond the glass, the parking lot stretched away under sodium lights. His truck sat where he'd left it. The other trucks remained dark and silent. But beyond the circle of light, the darkness seemed wrong. Not just night dark, but absolute. As if the rest stop existed in a bubble of illumination surrounded by void. And the highway. He couldn't see the highway. Couldn't see the exit ramp he'd driven down. Couldn't see anything beyond perhaps 50 feet except that consuming blackness. "It's not there," the man said, now standing beside Everett, though he hadn't heard him approach. "The highway, I mean. It's there for entering, but not for leaving. Took me about 4 hours to figure that out. Kept walking toward where the exit should be, and the darkness just kept going, walked for what felt like miles in a straight line, and when I turned around, the rest stop was still right there, exactly the same distance away. Everett's hand, the one holding the coffee cup, was trembling. He set the cup down carefully on a nearby table. "What is this place?" "A rest stop. Exactly what it looks like. Except it's not on any map, and once you pull in, you can't pull out." "That's impossible." "Is it? You driven past this spot before? This exact mile marker?" Everett thought about it. He drove this route monthly. Had for years. He knew every mile, every exit, every point where you could get good coffee or a decent meal, and there was no rest stop here. There had never been a rest stop here. "How long have you been here?" Everett asked. The man thought about this, his face working through some complex calculation. "Hard to say exactly. Time works funny. It's always 3:18 a.m. here, but I've slept maybe 50 times? 100? I don't need food anymore, but I get tired, so I sleep in my truck, and when I wake up, it's still 3 or 18. Still dark. Still this place." "You're saying you've been trapped here for months?" "I'm saying the concept of months doesn't apply. You'll understand eventually. The time inside your head keeps moving, but the time outside stays frozen. You age, or at least it feels like you age, but nothing changes. The same fluorescent bulbs, the same humming vending machines, the same absolute silence outside." Everett walked quickly toward the entrance doors. They opened automatically, and he stepped outside into humid air that felt exactly like the air had felt when he'd entered. His truck sat where he'd parked it, but when he walked toward it, his keys in hand, he felt something shift. Not movement exactly, but a wrongness in the relationship between himself and the vehicle. He reached it, opened the door, climbed inside. The interior smelled right, looked right. His logbook was where he'd left it, his coffee still cooling in the cup holder, his phone showing 3:18 a.m. and no signal, which was standard for rural stretches of I-40. He started the engine. The familiar diesel rumble was reassuring. He put the truck in gear, released the brake, and began to pull forward. The parking lot scrolled past as it should. He reached the exit, or where the exit should have been, and the truck simply stopped moving forward despite his foot on the gas, despite the engine responding, despite the wheels turning. It was like trying to drive through a wall that was invisible, that offered no resistance you could feel, but that prevented forward progress absolutely. Everett tried backing up, tried turning, tried approaching from different angles. Each time the same thing. Movement up to a certain point, then absolute stop, as if the rest stop existed in a pocket of space with immovable boundaries. He climbed out of the truck and walked toward the darkness beyond the parking lot's edge. The asphalt ended, gave way to grass, and then he stopped. Something about approaching that darkness triggered a deep revulsion, a primal certainty that crossing into it would be worse than staying. That whatever existed beyond the light was not merely absence, but something actively wrong. Something that shouldn't be examined too closely, because looking might draw its attention. The other trucker, Everett realized he hadn't gotten his name, was standing near the building, watching. "I tried that too," he called. "Probably everyone has. The darkness is worse than the rest stop. That's how this place works. It gives you two choices. Stay in the light, or step into whatever's out there. And once you understand what's out there, you stop considering it a choice." Everett walked back to the building. His legs felt weak, his chest tight with the beginning of the kind of panic he trained himself not to feel during 22 years of handling unpredictable highway conditions. Panic made you make mistakes. Panic killed truckers. "There has to be a way out," he said. "Does there? Why? Because that's how things are supposed to work?" The man laughed, but it was a sound without humor. "I thought that too. Thought there were rules, universal constants. Turns out some places don't follow them. Who are you?" Douglas Strand. Was a driver for Werner Enterprises out of Omaha. Pulled in here 14 months ago. Or maybe 14 years. Or maybe just 14 loops of falling asleep and waking up still here. Still 3:18 a.m. 14 months. The thought made Everett's knees weak. He sat down on the curb, his head in his hands. This wasn't real. This was a dream. He'd fallen asleep at the wheel, was experiencing some nightmare brought on by exhaustion and too much coffee and the low-level depression that had been his companion for years. Except he could feel the concrete rough under his palms, could smell the chemical clean of the rest stop, could taste the air thick with humidity. Dreams didn't have this texture. Reality did. "How many of us are there?" Everett asked. Douglas considered. "6 that I've talked to, more that I've seen, but who don't want to talk anymore. They sit in their trucks or stand by the building and don't respond when you approach them. I think they've just stopped, run out of whatever it is that makes you want to keep going." "Where are they now?" "The other 6. Around. Some sleep. Some walk circuits around the building. One guy, Marcus, he counts the ceiling tiles over and over. He's found 43 variations in the same pattern. He's convinced there's a code, that if he can crack it, it'll show him the way out." "Is there a way out?" Douglas looked at him with something like pity. "If there is, none of us have found it, and we've tried everything. Smashing windows, they don't break. Setting fires, they go out. Trying to walk into the darkness. You come back, even if you walk in a straight line for hours. This place wants us here, and what this place wants, it gets." Over what felt like days, but was still somehow 3:18 a.m. Everett met the others. Douglas had been right. There were 6 who would talk, and maybe a dozen more who'd retreated into themselves so completely they were effectively catatonic, standing or sitting in various positions around the rest stop. Their eyes open, but seeing nothing. He learned their names, their stories. They were all truckers, all solo drivers who'd pulled in during late-night hours, all trapped in this same pocket of frozen time. Some had been here for what felt like weeks, others claimed years. The math made his head hurt. If time didn't pass, how could duration exist? But his body disagreed with his watch. His body said he was aging, was growing tired and hungry and thirsty, even if those needs never quite reached emergency levels. The vending machines dispensed food and drinks that tasted wrong but satisfied hunger in a minimal way. The bathrooms functioned. The lights stayed on. The building was maintained by some unseen force, kept perpetually in the state of a rest stop between cleanings, never improving, never degrading. It was hell, Everett realized. Not the fire and brimstone kind, but something worse. Perfect stasis, eternal waiting, the promise that any moment you might leave, but the certainty that you wouldn't. He tried everything the others had tried to damage his way out, to think his way out, to pray his way out. None of it worked. The rest stop absorbed every attempt at escape with the indifference of a system that didn't care about human agency or desire or suffering. After what felt like 3 weeks, he stopped trying, started sitting in the building's corner, watching the automatic doors open and close for no one, listening to the vending machines hum, counting his breaths because it was something to count. That's when he saw the new arrival. An 18-wheeler pulled into the lot, the first new vehicle Everett had seen since his own arrival. The driver climbed down, a woman, maybe 40, moving with the particular stiffness of someone who'd been sitting too long. She walked toward the building with quick steps, clearly in need of a bathroom, clearly not noticing anything wrong yet. Everett stood up, rushed to the door, tried to warn her, to tell her not to enter, to get back in her truck and drive away while she still could. But his voice wouldn't work. His throat seized, his words caught behind teeth that wouldn't part. He stood at the glass doors, watching her approach, and couldn't make a sound. She walked past him, oblivious, headed straight for the bathroom. Everett turned to Douglas, who was watching with that same expression of pity. "You can't warn them," Douglas said. "I tried with you. Couldn't speak until you'd already come inside. That's the rule. Once you're trapped, you can talk about it. But before, the place won't let you." The woman emerged from the bathroom 10 minutes later, looking around the empty building with growing confusion, checking her watch, walking to the windows to look outside at darkness that shouldn't be there. And Everett watched her go through the same process he'd gone through, the same process they'd all gone through: disbelief, denial, testing, failing, understanding, despair. By the time she sat down with her head in her hands, Everett found he could speak to her, could tell her what this place was, what had happened, what would keep happening in this eternal frozen moment, could welcome her to hell. Her name was Vera Whitmore. She'd been driving for 16 years, had a son in college, an ex-husband in Phoenix, a life she'd been returning to after a delivery run. She listened to Everett explain with an expression that cycled through every stage of grief in minutes, and when he finished, she said, "How do we get out?" "We don't," he said. "We just stay." Over what felt like months, Everett stopped tracking time internally, stopped counting how many times he slept, how many times he walked circuits around the building, how many times he stared into the darkness beyond the light and felt its pull. He stopped thinking about his daughter, his ex-wives, the life he'd lived before the rest stopped. Those things existed in a different universe, a place where time moved forward and choices mattered. And tomorrow was something you could plan for. Here, there was only the eternal present. Only 3:18 a.m. Only the fluorescent lights and the vending machines and the other trapped souls who spoke less and less as whatever made them human slowly eroded. He stood at the window one night, though night and day had lost all meaning, and saw something he hadn't seen before. Far out in the darkness, at the very edge of visibility, lights. Not the orange-yellow of the rest stop's sodium vapors, but white and moving. Headlights. Hope flared in his chest, so painful he gasped. Someone was out there. Someone was driving past. Maybe they could see the rest stop, could stop, could somehow create a link between this pocket dimension and the real world that would let them escape. The headlights grew closer. Everett pressed his face against the glass, watching. The other truckers who were still conscious enough to notice had gathered at the windows, all of them watching the approaching vehicle with desperate hunger. The headlights came closer still, bright enough now that Everett could almost make out the vehicle's shape. A truck, another 18-wheeler, coming toward the rest stop, signaling right, pulling into the lot. The gathered truckers made sounds of despair. Not rescue, just another victim, another soul to be added to their collection, another person to watch go through the same process of understanding that led nowhere except acceptance. The new driver climbed down from his cab. Young, maybe 30. He walked toward the building with quick steps, and Everett tried again to warn him, to make a sound, to somehow communicate danger. But the rule held. His voice caught. His warning died unuttered, and the young man walked through the automatic doors into fluorescent brightness and eternal waiting, oblivious until the trap had already closed. "Welcome," Everett said when he could finally speak, and the word tasted like ashes. The young man looked at him with confusion that would become understanding, that would become horror, that would eventually, inevitably, become the same blank acceptance Everett saw in his own reflection. And outside, beyond the cone of light, the darkness waited patient as it had always waited. The highway that was there for entering but not for leaving hummed with invisible traffic, and time stayed frozen at 3:18 a.m., would stay frozen forever, would hold them all in this moment of late-night necessity until they forgot what movement felt like, what change meant, what it was to exist in a world where clocks advanced and distance could be traversed and rest stops were places you passed through rather than places that consumed you. Everett sat down in his corner. He would wait here, would watch new arrivals stumble into the trap, would count his breaths until he forgot why he was counting, would exist in this eternal pause until existing and not existing became the same thing, until he joined the catatonic others who stood like monuments to the futility of struggle, until he finally understood that some roads lead nowhere, and some stops are final, and some nights last forever without ever technically being night at all. And somewhere, his daughter was probably wondering why he hadn't called. His dispatcher was probably filing paperwork about an abandoned load. His truck was probably being listed as missing. But those concerns belonged to a different universe. One he could remember but no longer access. One that moved forward while he stayed frozen, a ghost haunting. His own eternal moment, forever arriving and never leaving. Forever 3:18 a.m. in a rest stop that didn't exist except for the people it had captured, and would capture, and would hold until time itself forgot what forward meant. Story 5. The lighthouse stood 3 miles offshore, accessible only by boat during calm seas, which meant most of the year it was effectively unreachable without risk. Clarice Ashford had researched this thoroughly before accepting the 6-month appointment as keeper. She'd read the incident reports 2 keepers lost to storms in the lighthouse's 80-year history. One keeper who'd requested early evacuation after 4 months citing personal reasons that were never elaborated upon. She'd studied the structure itself, automated since 1982, now maintained by the Coast Guard with quarterly inspections, but recently opened to a rotating keeper program meant to provide human monitoring and satisfy Preservation Society requirements. She'd applied because being 3 miles offshore sounded like exactly the solitude she needed after 18 months of unsuccessfully trying to recover from what her therapist called acute social exhaustion, and what Clarice privately thought of as the complete erosion of her ability to tolerate other human beings. The boat dropped her at the lighthouse's narrow pier on a Tuesday in April. The structure rose above her like a monument to isolation, 140 feet of white-painted brick, topped with a dark lantern room, where the automated light still rotated every night, sweeping its beam across empty ocean. The keeper's quarters were at the base, a small efficiency apartment with a bed, kitchenette, bathroom, and enough space to pace perhaps 10 steps in any direction. Perfect. The Coast Guard technician who'd piloted the boat helped her unload supplies, food for 2 weeks, fresh water, batteries, books, her laptop. Though internet access was limited to a satellite connection that functioned sporadically. "Radio check twice daily," he said, pointing to the marine radio mounted in the keeper's quarters. 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. If you miss 2 consecutive checks, we'll send someone to investigate. Emergency beacon is here. He indicated a red switch. But use it only for actual life or death situations. False alarms mean dismissal from the program. Clarice nodded, not trusting her voice. Speaking felt like effort, had felt like effort for months now. Better to simply acknowledge and move on. The boat departed, its engine noise fading until only the sound of waves against rock remained. Clarice stood on the pier and felt something in her chest loosen slightly. No people, no expectations, no performance of normalcy required. Just the lighthouse, the ocean, and 6 months to remember what it felt like to exist without constant negotiation of social contracts she'd never properly learned. She spent the first 3 days establishing routine. Wake at dawn, radio check. Walk the perimeter of the lighthouse's small island, perhaps 1,000 feet of rocky shoreline. Check the automated systems that she wasn't actually responsible for maintaining, but that gave her something to do. Read, make meals, radio check, watch the sunset, watch the light begin its nightly rotation. Sleep. It was during the 4th night that she first heard the singing. The sound woke her at 2 a.m., drifting through the open window of her quarters. Female voice, wordless but melodic, rising and falling with the rhythm of waves. Clarice lay in bed listening, her analytical mind cataloging possibilities, recordings from a passing boat, auditory hallucination brought on by isolation, some acoustic phenomenon where wind through the lighthouse's structure created voice-like sounds. She got up and went to the window. The singing continued, seemed to be coming from the rocks on the northern side of the island. She could see nothing in the darkness except the sweep of the lighthouse beam creating regular intervals of illumination against black water. The singing stopped abruptly. Clarice waited at the window for 20 minutes, heard nothing more, eventually returned to bed. But sleep was elusive, and she lay awake until dawn trying to convince herself that isolation couldn't possibly cause hallucinations this quickly. The singing returned the next night, and the night after that. Always between 2 and 3 a.m., always the same wordless melody, always seeming to come from the rocks, though Clarice could never locate a source. During the day, she searched the island thoroughly, finding nothing unusual, just granite, barnacles, tide pools, the occasional gull. On the 7th night, she saw the figure. It sat on the rocks perhaps 50 feet from her window, illuminated briefly by the lighthouse beam. Female form, or seemingly female, pale against dark stone. Long hair that moved in a way that didn't match the wind. Then darkness as the beam passed on. And when it returned, the rocks were empty. Clarice's heart hammered. She grabbed the flashlight from her bedside and went outside, her bare feet finding the rocks by memory. The singing had stopped. She swept her flashlight beam across the northern rocks, saw nothing but stone and sea spray. "Hello?" Her voice cracked from disuse. No response. The waves continued their eternal rhythm. The lighthouse beam swept past overhead, indifferent. She went back inside and made tea with hands that shook slightly. Hallucinations. Had to be. Isolation-induced psychosis, though the literature suggested it took weeks or months to develop, not days. But what else could explain seeing something that left no trace? The singing came again the next night. But this time, when Clarice went to the window, she saw multiple figures. 3 of them sitting on rocks at the water's edge, their forms visible for the few seconds when the lighthouse beam swept past. They seemed to be looking toward her quarters, their faces pale and featureless at this distance. Clarice didn't go outside this time. She sat at her window watching until dawn, and the figures remained on the rocks the entire night, illuminated at regular intervals by the rotating beam. She could see them move occasionally, shifting position, their heads turning to follow her when she moved around her room. At the morning radio check, she almost reported it. Almost said, "I'm seeing things that aren't there. Multiple humanoid figures on the rocks at night. They watch me, but leave no evidence." But the words stuck in her throat, and she gave the standard report. All systems normal, no issues to report. Because if she reported hallucinations, they'd evacuate her, would send her back to the mainland, back to the world of other people and their expectations and the exhausting performance of being someone who functioned normally in social spaces. She'd rather be here with her hallucinations than back there with her failures. The figures increased each night. By the end of the second week, there were perhaps a dozen, all sitting on the rocks in a rough circle around the base of the lighthouse, all watching her quarters, all singing in harmony that shouldn't have been possible if they were products of her imagination, because she couldn't carry a tune, had no musical training, couldn't have invented melodies this complex. Clarice stopped sleeping at night. She sat at her window cataloging details. The figures were predominantly female in appearance, though a few seemed male or indeterminate. Their clothing, when visible, appeared to be dark fabric that clung to their bodies as if wet. Their hair moved, independently of wind, sometimes hanging limp, sometimes drifting as if underwater. Their faces, when the lighthouse beam caught them at the correct angle, were too smooth, lacking the shadows that would indicate normal human features. During the day, she searched the island again, looking for any evidence. Found none. The rocks showed no footprints, no marks of habitation. The figures existed only at night, only when illuminated by the lighthouse beam, only visible from her window. She started photographing them. Her camera saw nothing, just rocks and darkness where the figures should have been. She tried recording the singing. The playback was only wind and waves, no melody. By the third week, the figures had moved closer. Some sat on the pier now, their legs dangling into water. Others stood at the base of the lighthouse, faces tilted up toward the lantern room. During the day, Clarice would find the spaces they'd occupied and feel residual cold, as if something had drawn heat from the stone. She stopped making morning radio checks, stopped maintaining her routines. She sat at her window day and night watching the rocks, waiting for nightfall when the figures would return. They were beautiful, she realized, pale and strange and terrible, but beautiful in the way impossible things often were. On the night of her 23rd day at the lighthouse, she went outside to meet them. The singing surrounded her immediately, no longer distant but present, coming from throats that stood inches away, though she could see nothing in the darkness between the lighthouse beam's rotations. She felt hands on her arms, cold, soft, insistent. Felt herself being led toward the rocks, toward the water's edge. The lighthouse beam swept past. For its brief illumination, she saw them clearly. Faces that were almost human, eyes that were black and depthless, mouths open in song. Their hands on her arms looked pale as bone, fingers too long, joints too numerous. Then darkness. The hands pulled her gently but firmly toward the water. She heard splashing, felt cold spray on her skin. The singing grew louder, shifted from melody to something closer to language, words in a tongue she didn't know but somehow understood. They were welcoming her. They were calling her home. The lighthouse beam swept past again. Clarice saw she was at the water's edge, waves lapping at her feet. The figures surrounded her, their faces close to hers, their mouths forming words that became the singing that had no words. She understood then what they were, what they'd always been. Not hallucinations, not madness, but something that lived in the spaces between land and sea. Something that appeared to people who'd isolated themselves beyond normal human limits. Something that offered a different kind of existence for those who could no longer tolerate the regular kind. The water was very cold when she stepped in. The figures moved with her, their hands supporting her as she waded deeper. The singing became laughter, or perhaps weeping. The sound was identical, she realized, when stripped of context. The lighthouse beam swept past. She was waist-deep now, her clothes heavy with water. The figures were in the water with her, their forms more suited to this environment, moving with grace that suggested this was their natural element. Another rotation, shoulder deep. Her feet no longer touched bottom. The hands that held her were keeping her afloat, or pulling her down. She couldn't tell which. The singing was inside her head now, was her own thoughts translated into music. The next rotation, she was underwater. She should have been panicking, should have been fighting for the surface. Instead, she felt peaceful. The figures surrounded her, their faces finally clear in the green darkness of the ocean. They were smiling, or what passed for smiling on faces that lacked normal musculature. Their eyes reflected light that wasn't there. They gave her a choice. She understood. She could surface, could swim back to the lighthouse, could radio for emergency evacuation, could return to the mainland and the world of other people, and eventually find some compromise between her need for solitude and society's expectations for participation. Or she could stay here, could let herself become what they were, neither living nor dead, neither human nor other, but something that existed in the liminal spaces, that appeared to the isolated and the lost, that sang in the darkness and waited for people who'd wandered too far from shore. Clarice's lungs were burning. Her vision was darkening at the edges. She needed to decide. The Coast Guard found the lighthouse abandoned 3 days later after Clarice missed 6 consecutive radio checks. Her belongings were still in the keeper's quarters. Her bed was unmade. Her laptop showed browser history of isolation effects and auditory hallucinations, searches that suggested she'd been experiencing symptoms but hadn't reported them. They searched the island thoroughly, found no sign of her, no indication she'd fallen, no evidence of accident or suicide, just absence, as if she'd simply dissolved into air or water, or the space between them. The program was suspended. The lighthouse returned to purely automated operation, but the Coast Guard inspection reports from subsequent visits noted unusual phenomena. Singing heard at night, figures seen on the rocks that left no traces, a sense of being watched from the water. The locals, when asked, said the lighthouse had always been haunted, said keepers had been disappearing since the structure was built, claimed by something that lived in the surrounding waters, something that called to people who'd isolated themselves beyond salvation. But officially, Clarice Ashford was simply listed as missing. Her family, minimal as it was notified. Her apartment on the mainland was cleaned out, her possessions distributed or discarded. Her therapist made notes about the dangers of extreme isolation for patients with social exhaustion. Everyone agreed she'd made a poor choice accepting such a remote position. Only the new keepers, when the program eventually resumed, understood differently. They heard the singing, they saw the figures, and sometimes on particularly clear nights when the lighthouse beam swept across the rocks at just the right angle, they saw one figure that looked familiar, pale and strange and terrible, but smiling in a way Clarice Ashford had never smiled in her life on land. And the singing continued, night after night, calling to anyone isolated enough to hear it, to anyone exhausted enough by the demands of being human that the alternative, whatever the alternative was, began to sound not like horror, but like relief. Thank you for spending these dark hours with me. I hope these stories have given you exactly what you needed tonight. That particular shiver that reminds us we're alive, even when confronting the impossible. If you found something here that resonated, that kept you listening, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing, but only if these tales truly spoke to you. Otherwise, I'll simply be glad you were here. Sleep well if you can. And if tonight's stories follow you into your dreams, remember, fiction can only haunt us if we let it. Though sometimes, the letting is the most honest thing we do. This has been the Stillness Broadcast. Until tomorrow night, when the darkness gathers again.